Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah. Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. And welcome to the 12th session of Islamicate book reviews with myself, Usaama al-Azami, and my colleague at Edinburgh University, Dr. Omar Anchassi. This is a wonderful opportunity for me to ask Omar about what he's been reading lately. And this week he's going to be discussing a wonderful book by Simonetta Calderini, Women as Imams, Classical Islamic Sources and Modern Debates on Leading Prayer. And the standard format is Omar will talk for 10 minutes or so, and then I will engage him in a conversation about the book for maybe about half an hour, followed by Q&A. And the Q&A is basically an opportunity for anyone who's watching to write in a chat, whether they're on Facebook, whether they're on YouTube, and we'll be able to get that. We'll be able to share that on the screen, and we welcome your sort of engagement in that regard. So without further ado, I'd like to welcome Omar to give a presentation on the book.
Thank you, Usaama. This is a much-awaited and very important book. Simonetta mentions, or perhaps I'll refer to as Dr. Calderini, mentions that its genesis began as the result of a conversation with an Indian imam in 2009. She's published many articles on the subject since then. She's been quite prolific. And this book has finally come out, I think, early in 2021, if I'm not mistaken, with IB Taurus. And the book breaks down, or is comprised of, an introduction and 4 body chapters. The introduction, of course, setting the scene and introducing us to important general considerations and points of methodology and so on. And those 4 chapters are divided into 2 parts. The first 3 chapters explore women's imamate, their leadership of prayer, both of other women and of men, in legal, historical, and hadith sources, focusing on the 7th to the 12th centuries of the Common Era, but drawing on sources until the 14th. The 4th and final chapter, in the second part of the book, focuses on modern debates about women's ritual leadership in prayer. The 19th and 20th and 21st centuries in particular, looking at a range of contexts, both majority Muslim contexts and also very significantly minority ones as well. It's very thoroughly researched. As far as I can tell, it's almost to the point of exhaustiveness if you look at the sources she draws on, as will become clear in our comments. The first chapter explores imamate and women in ritual purity, prayer leadership, and these kinds of things in general. The second chapter looks at women's leadership of other women in prayer. The third chapter looks at women's leadership of men in prayer specifically. And then, as I said, the 4th chapter looks at these modern debates. So she makes a number of broad observations in the introduction and also in the first chapter. She situates herself not as an activist, so this is not a book advocating women's leadership of prayer, although she does come across as sympathetic to the cause. So right at the end of the book, she compares female imams, if you like, to the early female martyrs of Islam. And towards the end of the book, she even, you could say, criticizes those who disregard the various explicit hadith on women's imamate as being themselves guilty of bid'ah, which is interesting. But a couple of major observations in the first chapter, especially this very important connection between the imamate, or al-imam al-kubra wa sughra. So the imamate is political leadership versus leadership of ritual prayer. And this is a distinction and a connection, you could say, jurists frequently drawn in their discussion of these issues. Ritual purity in some sense is gendered, although people are not, or the ritual impurity is not substantive, so you do not have impure persons, or impure human beings, at least in Islamic law, according to most jurists. By virtue of haid and nifas, menstruation and postpartum bleeding and so on, there are certain periods when women are ritually impure. But this is not a contagious impurity, again, according to most jurists, because you do have discussion of this in the early period. One observation or motif, if you like, throughout the book is this notion of the appropriation or mobilization of the past in argument. Whatever position believers take on this issue, they are always involved in discussing and debating and constructing a particular account of the past. For instance, drawing on the famous hadith of Waraqah, in some variants of which she led her household in prayer, or her dar could be interpreted as a household. Navin Reda interprets this term as a kind of locality, so even broader than this. And Dr. Calderini says dar probably indicates, a tribal or clan grouping, so maybe even wider than simply a household, depending on how you interpret this word. But Muslims are engaged in this debate about what the past means and how it can be used and deployed in argument. So that's one theme that flows throughout the book. Another key observation, which echoes, I think, something I've researched, a point that is reasonably well established, and I think there's still a lot more to say about it. I mean, Eli Al-Sheikh has written about awra, or zones of privacy in Islamic law, from the 8th century onwards, but especially from about the 11th or 12th, when you compare and contrast women's agency as depicted in early hadith texts, for instance, with the situations a few centuries on. In the interests of minimizing fitna, jurists on a whole range of issues, and we see many instances of this, come to be more conservative, quote unquote. So, for example, when it comes to the Hanafi school, early jurists such as At-Tahawi, when it comes to female imamate of other women in prayer, do not approve of it completely, but it is a position that we can characterize as karaha tanzihiyya. It's disliked, but it's permissible, it's valid. Nonetheless, later jurists, especially in the Hanafi madhab, she mentions Kasani and Sarakhsi, say that women's imamate of other women, of course, is mansukh. It's abrogated. It's not exactly clear when. Is this after the death of the Prophet, alayhi salatu wasalam? She does not invoke these words, but it's an example of this fasad al-zaman argument. And Dr. Calderini points out it is always deployed to restrict women's ritual agency. Now, there are other areas of the law where you find something slightly different, but as a general rule, this is certainly true. And the report of Aisha about women's going to the mosques, and if the Prophet knew what was happening, he would have prohibited this and so on. It's well known, discussed in Omar Anchassi book. So there are many things going on in this book. In discussing women's leadership of other women in prayer, I've already pointed you to this slowly emerging more prohibitive attitudes within the Hanafi school. Generally speaking, though, when you look at early sources like Ibn Abi Shaybah and his Musannaf, the Kufans and Basrans are quite tolerant of female imamate. And even the hadith of Waraqah, even in the variants where she leads her household in prayer, including men in some variants, presumably, these also have Kufan and Basra instead. So the Iraqis were generally quite, or Iraqians, as Joseph Schacht would say, were quite lenient about this. In contrast to the Medinans, who, as Ben Sadeghi points out, that Medina is where the categorical prohibition emerged. You do not find the question of female imamate discussed in the Muwatta, but it's there in the Mudawwana and many subsequent sources. Generally speaking, with some exceptions, one student of Malik, according to Al-Baji, says that Malik permitted female imamate, but the Medinans are generally against female imamate categorically, even when it comes to leadership of other women in prayer. The Shafi'is and Hanbalis generally accept it. The later ones, some of them come to dislike it. And this mirrors the Shafi'i and Hanbali opinion on women's access to mosques and ritual spaces. So interestingly, you have this curious phenomenon whereby the Shafi'is and Hanbalis, probably because of their textualist commitments, Calderini indicates, are actually more easygoing about women leading other women in prayer, and also their access to mosques. Of course, 13th, 14th century onwards, there comes to be some further discussion of this, and they deploy this fasad al-zaman argument increasingly. Now, In the third chapter, she discusses the hadith of Waraqa in particular, and also this curious incident involving the early Khawarizmite woman who dies in the year 77, Ghazal al-Haruriya, the wife of Shabib bin Yazid al-Shaybani. She establishes that, notwithstanding some modern claims, Ghazala is never reported in pre-modern sources as having led the prayer, as having led men in prayer. This is a misreading of the sources, and Calderini notes that it reflects modern assumptions and modern readings much more than it does pre-modern sources. But when it comes to, and in the hadith of Waraqa, of course, there are many variants of it, reported in, for instance, Ibn Sa'd in his Tabaqat, the Sahih of Ibn Khuzaymah, Sunan Abi Dawood, the Musnad of Ahmad, and so on, and also Sunan of Daraqutni in more than one version. In the Sunan of Daraqutni, he specifies that she led the female members of our household in prayer. So when those against female prayer of female imamate of men invoke the hadith, they mention specifically the variant mentioned by Daraqutni, which specifies that she led the women of a household in prayer. But in Ibn Sa'd and in other versions like Abu Dawood, they mention that she had a mu'adhin, and in the version reported by Abu Dawood, the mu'adhin is a rawi of the hadith, Abdurrahman al-Ansari. So it's clear that she is leading not just women, but also the men of a household in prayer. And she discusses varying interpretations of this and transmissions of the hadith and so on. And she discusses various legal schools. In the modern debate, she looks at the institution of women's mosques in both Muslim majority and minority contexts. A number of these have been established recently, but it is a historical phenomenon. It's not entirely modern. And also in this fourth chapter, very interesting exploration of course, the debate we're all familiar with in one way or another, women's leadership of men in prayer, especially the scholarship on this exploding after the 2005 prayer led by Amina Wadud, and she explores responses to this by Muslim muftis and legal authorities in the Muslim majority world, but also debates on it in the Western world and other minority contexts. So hopefully that gives you a clear sense of the structure of the book and what she's doing. A lot of stuff going on in this book, and it's an impressive work, and I really enjoyed reading it. I should say finally, Usaama, that it's extremely accessible. It is something that specialists can benefit from, but also your general educated readers, they would say. So it includes a glossary at the end to make it nice and accessible. And it's a very timely book, given this recent, one friend reminded me, this BBC interview with the new head of the Muslim Council of Britain, specifically that mentioned this issue. So a timely, very important and much awaited book that I enjoyed reading. Right.
Thank you, Omar. I mean, that's really a wonderful, comprehensive overview of the text, as much as is possible in basically sort of 12 minutes or so. And I really appreciate it, and I'm sure our listeners will appreciate it. But I think the thing you mentioned about the BBC interview also highlights, in a sense, the sort of feverish environment in which a lot of these debates take place. And it's nice to see someone like Calderini bring this to a sober sort of and very, very sort of deeply informed, as you put it, exhaustive. I've read through sections of the book, but I did notice that it's the ends of the chapters are very, very offer very detailed notes on everything that's being mentioned. And it's always impressive to me when you have an author dealing with a contemporary issue, but is able to have so much coverage of the pre-modern discourse.
Yes.
And that, that's a sign of great...
I should say, I mean, you have philology in this text, of course, reading of this pre-modern legal text. You also have, discourse analysis. So it's very interdisciplinary, something she emphasizes in the introduction. Right.
Although, I mean, I was also sort of, and this is something I remarked to you briefly earlier, that in a sense, all discourse is situated naturally. including scholarly discourse. And so she begins with this anecdote of being in Parliament and bumping into this sort of leader of Imams in India who, said that they represented 500,000 Imams in the country. And she asked, "Are there any women among them?" And his his face kind of froze, and he was like, "What was that?" And he just completely ignored the question. And I think that also underlines a kind of this is a debate that has arisen in a particular context, and it's sort of very uncomfortable in many respects in some other contexts. And there is that tension there. The discomfort, to a certain extent, may be a question specifically of the loss of privilege potentially. And I also think that there's naturally, as we've discussed many a time in the past here, there's that tension between seeking justice for women, but also recognizing that certain perspectives on justice for women that are being advocated in English. I mean, what's really interesting is, why is this book being written in English rather than in Arabic, right? Or rather than, the gentleman who's coming from India with 500,000 Imams, rather than in Hindi.
Yes, so it's a great series of questions.
Yeah.
I mean, she does point to this anecdote with Hajja Faiza in the work of Saba Mahmoud, and she says that we must not assume that assertions of women's agency are coterminous with women's resistance to patriarchy. So even within patriarchal context, you can have assertions of women's agency, and this comes up again when she's discussing women's mosques, like this one that kind of operates periodically in Los Angeles, the Women's Mosque of America, established in 2015 or 16. That you could say that this is liberating to women. Others would say that it perpetuates a kind of separation of the genders in public space, if you like. So there are different ways of approaching this, but certainly Dr. Calderini is sensitive to the political dimensions of the question, and she explores at some length. Because this is, of course, an ongoing debate, but there are distinctions between how jurists discussed it in in 16th century Istanbul versus how it's discussed today. It is no longer the preserve of a scholarly elite, and women, instead of being the subjects, if you like, are now participants in the discussion, which is of course, a crucial development. Instead of being merely talked about, they are also leading prayer in some cases and talking back.
Absolutely. And this kind of is reminiscent of a sort of point that was raised in the last week's discussion when we were looking at Shah Lahari's book, and the fact that, I think she mentions there that, the first tafsir of the Quran written by a woman, as far as we can tell, and it's not really a comprehensive tafsir, is by the daughter of, Uthman Dan Fodio, which is in the 19th century or something along those lines. And, in a sense, the sort of fiqhi or scholarly voice of women is, she kind of, Calderini suggests this by talking about, I've uncovered a secret history or something along those lines towards the introduction, that, these are all there in the secondary source, in the primary sources, but they need to be unearthed. And I think that's what a lot of, excellent gender scholarship does. It, looks at these, it looks at these sources that we've known for so long, and it, really gives us a refreshing new perspective that we've, for all sorts of reasons, ideological or otherwise, kind of not really grappled with at all. So in that regard, I think, Yes,
and its comprehensiveness, I think, is the main contributor. Of course, many kind of debates being explored in the book, but you've had lots of debate about the hadith of Umaraqa, but this book really adds. I mean, I would have loved to see isnad diagrams and trees, but she does actually pass the isnad. So as well as saying, pro imamate, asanid are generally Iraqi, Kufan and Basran. She looks at Mrs. Tuhfat al-Ishraf to even evaluate the rawis of the hadith, which is lovely.
Fantastic. Which is, I mean, in a sense, the Isnad Kam Matn analysis has now become, normative almost, and I think that really enriches our scholarship. And
yeah, so I should add, she says very clearly she's not making any claims about the historicity of these reports.
Yes, absolutely.
But clearly, according to this, and something that even Jonathan Brown and others have mentioned, Nevin Redda, that if you look at the hadith of Waraqah, for example, and the hadith of women leading other women in prayer, she mentions a number of reports. Aisha, Salama, and Qamama bint Sa'da, and the area of Ali Zain al-Abidin and Abdullah bin Umar instructor women to lead praying. These are credible sources according to the standards of classical hadith criticism. Right. So when she curiously accuses people of disregarding these hadith of bid'ah, she's making a serious point, which is if the basis of legal discussion is authoritative hadith, then why are we not paying attention to this hadith, which is a kind of long-standing criticism that the various jurists have made.
It's ironic. I mean, she's calling it bid'ah, and that criticism is actually, it sounds like a very common Salafi criticism as well, which is great.
She points out,
Sorry, I was just going to say, she does signal, for example, Behnam Sadiqi's remark that at the end of the day, a lot of the time, the fiqh seems to have been ex post facto rationalization using the sources rather than drawing on in the way.
Yeah, so Sadiqi is definitely one of her more important interlocutors, as well as Marian Katz, of course, the great Marian Katz, and indeed others. Now, Sadiqi's book is also extremely important, of course. And what Sadiqi really shows is that Islamic law, it's a point made by other scholars, Shaman Jackson in his article Fiction and Formalism, Atif Ahmed as well in his book on structural interrelations, that fiqh is more than simply an equation of Quran plus hadith equals fatwa. And this is, now when it comes to the issue of women, and in particular women's imamate, either of other women or of men in prayer, this is writ large, if you like. So how is it that a jurist like al-Tahawi can dislike but permit female imamate? Shaybani, she says لا يعجبنا, but says it's at least for supererogatory prayer that it is acceptable. And later jurists like Kassani say that it is mansur. So clearly there's a development going on. And it's a huge sociological question. How do you explain this increasing conservatism? She suggests, for example, that the Muslims kind of acclimatized to the broader Near Eastern society into which they emerge over time. The Prophet, his society was not a highly stratified one if you compare it to the neighboring Byzantine or Sicilian empires. And this was
Sorry, I was just going to say, this does seem to be quite common in a lot of, for want of a better expression, in primitive societies, there's a lot less hierarchy, a lot more flattening, including between genders and the roles that males and females play in society very often.
Absolutely.
Not as, rigorously differentiated. And I'm interested to sort of actually explore or understand and get your impressions on this as well. When I first read Marian Katz's book, which is on the shelf behind me, Women sort of in the Mosque, I was struck by this suggestion. I don't think she made it quite so forcefully, but she basically said it's quite strongly suggested in the literature that there is this kind of fasad al-zaman argument. As time passes, the notion of fitna changes from one sense of sort of social discord and the first fitna being actual civil war, to a notion of women, being a cause of fitna because of temptation and these sorts of things. And I just sort of wonder, partly because, there are, of course, some hadiths, and she does mention them, we're speaking of cats right now, that there are some hadiths that suggest, female fitna already, although, we need to see how historical they are, I suppose. But I would imagine that, Sunnis consider them authentic, which is another, this is a slightly separate point I'll just make very quickly, but I think Calderini makes a very good point in terms of making the distinction between what is legally efficacious and what is historical. So she's not making claims on historicity, but, as other scholars have pointed out.
So now, she mentions Brown's work on this, even weak hadith can be generative of legal norms.
Right, precisely. And That in a sense helps us bracket the authenticity debate when we're dealing with these things in practice, and that's very useful as a sort of methodological tool, I think, in Western Islamic studies. But with respect to Marian Katz's argument, I just sort of wonder, what you think as someone who's read both books and has been reading in this sort of area. How plausible is that sort of argument that there is actually? Is it across the board? Is it jurists geographically spread across different sort of?
Yeah, one great fact that Calderini brings our attention to is that even rabbis in the late ancient period use this argument about the devil's insinuation to advocate for the separation of men and women in synagogues. Now, she doesn't go into this at great length, but it is not a development one assumes that is distinctive to Islamic society. Now, of course, Jews were residents of the Near East and already part of these highly stratified societies, unlike the earliest Muslims. But I think a recognition of this distinction, and Pernilla Miley has made a similar point, it's there already in al-Jahid's Risala fil Qiyan. The women who tend to speak up in these early sources, as Mina says, are either Bedouins or early Muslims, or in later periods, like in the Abbasid period, slave women. But there is an awareness, I think, even within the tradition itself, by authors like Al-Jahid, of this increasing, if you like, conservatism.
You mentioned 2 secondary sources. Can you sort of give the titles of the works as well?
I'll put those in the comments. Yeah.
Sure. But I mean, just for the listener as well.
The Risala fil Qiyan of Al-Jahid has been translated by Beeston as the Epistle on Singing Girls.
You mentioned Mina?
Mina, her book on female sexuality in the early medieval Islam, called something like, it's a fantastic book on female sexuality. There's not a huge amount of literature on this. The scholarship, like the primary sources, of course, tends to privilege the male. This is why Mina's book is very interesting. Sure. Now, I think Calderini, this argument is very compelling. I think explaining this development is a very big historical question, and others have made the similar kind of point in different ways. Barbara Freya, the late Barbara Freya Stoas also has made this point. For instance, when it comes to the example she gives is jurists holding that veiling of the face is obligatory. Later jurists are much more insistent on this than early ones.
Right, absolutely.
I know we could say more about that, but to kind of return to the book.
Right.
So, I mean, there are a number of reports I mentioned, Salama, Qamama bin Sa'd and others, of women leading women in prayer with Iraqi isnads, and there's no good reason to disregard these besides madhab loyalty. And yet we see, and I should say, in addition to, just to illustrate the comprehensiveness, this is not just, as is often the case in Islamic studies, Islamic equals Sunni. No, so he brings both 12 jurists, especially Shaykh al-Ta'ifa, Ibn Babawayh al-Allam al-Hilli, as well as Ismailis, of course, her first book on a woman in the Fatimid context, co-authored with Adila Qutaisi, and she's published an article on Qadi Nu'man. And Qadi Nu'man is very interesting because he gives sort of symbolic interpretations of these restrictions on female agency. So he talks about the male as the active principle, if you like, versus the female as the passive, and you cannot, women cannot lead men in the same way that a student cannot summon a teacher, right? That's not how authority works.
Right.
And of course, this is this symbolic, if you like, element of the discussion we find also in Ibn al-Arabi, not the Qadi, but the mystic, dies in 1240. And his views have been mentioned, but in the Futuhat, he categorically approves of female imamate, even over men, saying that all spiritual stations, including the Qutb itself, is available to women. So that's very interesting. But a curious point is many, the legal authorities who tended to be most permissive when it came to female imamate, at least of other women, tended to be the textualist jurists, because there are these precedents very clearly in a number of sources. And by a similar token, those who permit female leadership of men in prayer in different contexts also tend to be textual inclined. So Abu Thawr and Tabari, according to Ibn Rushd, categorically approve of female leadership in prayer, even over other men, even for obligatory prayers. There are others like Al-Muzani.
Interject. So, I mean, I also want you to sort of perhaps comment after you've made this remark that about the way in which, how is it the early Kufans seem to have been open to this, but, the Hanafi madhab, as you say, it's mansukh in later sort of discussions, and that's kind of the muftabi. But I wonder if there are reports from Abu Hanifa himself within the madhab.
So in the Kitab al-Athar, she mentions Muhammad ibn al-Hasan cites a report via the isnad Abu Hanifa, Hamad ibn Abi Sulaiman, Ibrahim al-Nakhai, that permits women's leadership of other women in prayer.
Okay.
But even Shaybani is not completely comfortable with this. He says, La yu'jibuna.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's an impeccable isnad, as it were. So in terms of knowing what Hanifa's position was on the question, and it's really interesting because the later school generally, in my experience as someone who's trained in the Hanafi madhab, so to speak, is to go with the position of Abu Hanifa wherever possible. So it's very rarely that they depart from it. And so, ostensibly that would be the position, but I've not heard that as the position, shall we say. So maybe this is one of the places where they do depart from it.
The Hanafi school is extremely interesting and, not to pick them up or anything, but distinctive, it seems.
Right.
And this really comes through and dynamic in terms of how their rulings change, I think to a greater extent and in a more kind of sophisticated way than any other legal school, frankly.
Interesting.
There's something that comes across very strongly in Nurat Safrir's book on the Aqila, which focuses on the Hanafis. Their rulings kind of take account of the context and bonds of solidarity, how that changes sociologically much more than other schools. So I think there's a kind of big argument to be made there about the Hanafis. Now, as Sadeghi as well as Calderini have pointed out, you get this curious phenomenon of reinterpretation of authorities' opinions.
Right.
So, and it's something Sadeghi says in the context of women in prayer as well. The statements of Abu Hanifa or the Sheikh or Imam Muhammad and so on of karaha tanzihiyya, this kind of dislike that is not prohibitive, are reinterpreted by later authorities as tahrim. Karaha tahrimiyya, so prohibiting. It's a very, very common phenomenon. I've seen it a number of times, and both Sadeghi and Calderini give examples of it. I should say the 12 Shia, like the Shafi'is and Hanbalis, are generally fine with one leading other women in prayer. And she brings up so many interesting legal views. And to give an example of this reinterpretation, she cites Shaykh al-Ta'ifa as saying that he even permits women's calling of the adhan for men's prayer. Now, this causes problems for, women's voices, awra, as al-Allam al-Hilli says. And he says, it may be, and I haven't seen the Arabic, but, ربما Shaykh al-Ta'ifa meant women and specifically the household or something like this. So very implausible interpretations, but all under the guise of staying within the kind of confines of the tradition. So again, one of the major, really the major motif of the book is not only continuity and rupture, but also these arguments about the past, how it is constructed and deployed in different ways. So even, those who are advocating what is actually a change from, in legal opinion, still can kind of present themselves as retaining a fidelity to the tradition, like the Hanafis, Kassani, and so on.
Right. I mean, if we take a kind of McIntyrean conception of tradition, tradition is an argument extended through time, and it's about sort of arguing with insiders and outsiders of the tradition. And in a sense, what matters, and this is my sort of defense, so to speak, of the Hanafis against the Shafis. So the Shafis are the textualists and the Hanbalis follow them, but the Hanafis and the Malikis to a certain extent try and retain this kind of, and the Hanafis even to this day kind of have all sorts of mechanisms to justify their distinctions from the textual corpus very often. It's the fact that at the end of the day, it's the tradition of the madhab, which is seen as a better vehicle for the sunnah of the Prophet than the actual hadith. And it's obviously the case that Shafi'i's argument was incredibly influential, and people like Ahmed Shamsi have demonstrated that, and scholars before him. But I think that tenacity of the Hanafis to this day speaks volumes.
Yes. This is a point made at length by Dr. Suhail Hanif in his thesis on Modernity, that even with the kind of triumph of Shafi'i's argument about the authoritativeness and authority of the hadith corpus, even in later kind of early or classical medieval texts like Modernity, for him what is authoritative is the views of the Kufans, in particular Abu Hanifa and his circle.
Right.
But as moderns, we can ask questions about, well, yes, it's nice to kind of follow this tradition, but at what cost? I mean, especially in minority contexts, right? I mean, she cites this 2009 Gallup poll that in the United States, female mosque attendance is almost level with male mosque attendance.
Right.
Now, so this is worth bearing in mind.
Absolutely. I mean, I'm certainly sort of not suggesting that people should strictly adhere to a single madhab in the form that it existed in in a particular context historically. And I think even someone like Behnam Sadeghi, is quite conscious about, how legal change does happen when things become extremely uncomfortable. I can't remember his exact phrasing for that. And law, in a sense, again drawing on people like Khalid al-Fadl, it's about continuity as much as possible. So when things have to change, law is very conservative by default, as it were. But in our times, it makes a great deal of sense to have the flexibility that people like Ahmed Fakhri Ibrahim talk about in Pragmatism in Islamic Law. That that really, if Ibrahim's book is anything to go by, that seems to be quite, accepted in the later centuries in the Central Islamic lands, that you can switch between madhahib, engage in takhayyur, although I'm not sure I agree with his characterizing takhayyur and tabu' al-rukhas as the same thing. But no, I think this is really sort of eye-opening a discussion with you, as always. I want to remind people.
It's the book that's really eye-opening, of course.
Sorry, say again?
It's the book that's really eye-opening, of course.
Of course. And I mean, we reiterate every time we have a book on gender by a female author that, this is we are very conscious of our positionality in this entire discussion. So we're very grateful to Simonetta Calderini for her wonderful book in this regard. And I just want to remind everyone, we're coming on to almost 40 past, and we'll soon be trying to address some of the questions that are coming in. A couple have come in, and we'd love to have your questions. Please feel free to add them in Facebook or in the chat on YouTube, and it'll show up for us, and we look forward to addressing that.
I should say something about one thing that I was only dimly aware of, that she explores, especially in the fourth and the final body chapter.
Right.
Both the notion of women's mosques, which you find in China in the 18th century onwards, and I mean, even in Muslim majority contexts today, many, including Senegal and the Comoro Islands and many other contexts. The Maldives is an interest. Maldives or Mauritius? Mauritius, I believe, is an interesting one, because in the 1970s, the government recognized these women's only mosques. And in 2005, there were as many as 250 of them, but they've all since been shuttered, reportedly for financial reasons. But even in pre-modern contexts, particularly among the Hui ethnic group, or Minsu in the Chinese context, not among the Uyghurs, for instance, which is interesting. You had these institutions, and she refers us as anthropologists have done most of the cutting edge work on this kind of phenomenon, not so much historians. Ingrid Mattson says the new Ahongs, these kind of female spiritual elites, are not prayer leaders as such, but anthropologists have actually observed them leading prayer. So that's not entirely true, Calderini suggests. And you find similar phenomenon elsewhere in the Muslim majority world. So Now, one thing that does seem to be distinctive, as far as I can tell, to the minority context, is women's leadership of men in prayer.
Right.
And I think both of us are old enough to remember quite well the reaction when Woodward led this prayer in New York in 2005. I remember I was a teenager at the time, and not the Imam, but a kind of masjid uncle was very upset about this, and he was crying, saying, a woman has led prayer, this is a calamity. And she explores this debate very interestingly, both in the majority and minority context. Naveen Reda in 2005, I think shortly before, or perhaps shortly after, I forget, the prayer, published an important article on the site Muslim Wake Up, kind of defending this action using the hadith of Waraqah. And AMJA, the Assembly of Muslim Jurists of America, published like an anthology of fatwa, kind of disagreeing with this perspective, only one of which was contributed by female, actually, the scholar al-Azami, who said it violates the sanctity of our ibadat. Interestingly, I hadn't realized this, but Qaradawi, Calderini reports, permits women's leadership of men in prayer, in the household, even obligatory prayer. And you had a range of responses to Rida and other arguments put forward by advocates of female. Off the top of my head, I don't remember. But I do know that she doesn't mention Muhammad al-Ghazali, but Muhammad al-Ghazali did say something about female imamate as well. I think that the context of Bint Tashat is saying she's so learned, how could men not pray? But something like this.
Right. I think my recollection is that Qaradawi at the time actually objected, but he may very well have been objecting to the fact that this was a public sort of prayer and public event.
So Jum'ah is now, there are a number of positions. So she even mentions Ibn Taymiyyah, and one riwayah from Ahmed is that in cases of necessity, at least according to Ibn Taymiyyah, so the men are all illiterate and only the woman knows Quran, a woman can lead men in prayer and Taraweeh in the household even. But then you have other opinions. So Abu Thawr and Tabari categorically permit female imamate, and within these you have different views.
Right.
Yes.
If you Musannaf works, the response. So I remember, I think there was a debate on Al Jazeera Arabic at the time. It might still be. The great thing about some of these news organizations is you can Google the debates and you'll be able to read the details now. But Taha Jabal Alawani was in discussion with Amina Wadud on Al Jazeera, if I recall correctly.
Oh, interesting.
And so the presenter sort of, I think, mentions that Yusuf Qaradawi said that this was impermissible or something like this, or no one has given the fatwa that this is permissible. And then Taha Jabal Alawani says, no, actually Abu Thawr and Al-Tabari give this position, right? So he's not entirely correct in that regard. But yes, it's what's interesting about these sorts of aqwal in the Musannaf works. Usually they're found, I'm not sure about these two authors.
Those two are in Bidayat al-Mujtahid. Right. There are lots of sources, she says, where Tabari is said to have permitted both women's judgeship, qada, and imama categorically. So that's not just, but the one it's normally cited from is Bidayat al-Mujtahid, I think.
So, and that makes a lot of sense. Those are somewhat later than the Musannaf works, as it were. But in Musannaf works, the anxiety that you hear from a lot of people on these sorts of questions, once you go to the Musannaf works and you can dig up all sorts of weird and wonderful opinions, right, on everything. And
selling foundlings as slaves, debt slavery. All kinds of weird. Right. As al-Awza'i, isn't it, who said something like "Man tatabba'a rukhas al-ulama tazandaq," or something along these lines.
Right.
And Brown has an article in this edited volume. Is it Reinventing or Reclaiming Islamic Tradition? I think edited by Elizabeth Kendall and Ahmed Khan. On the opinion of Ibn Shubrama on minor marriage, and also opinions permitting certain kinds of riba being mobilized in the modern period. This is what happens in the modern period. People excavate these works.
Right.
And as Calderini says, a new context has arisen whereby some opinions, there's a real traction, or there's a kind of context in which one can invoke them in a popular way.
And I think that, I need to reread Jonathan Brown's article on this. But I remember having a conversation with him, and he saying something along the lines of, most of the scholars say that you can't just dig up a position from one of the Musannaf works because you don't really know its mustanad. It's not been systematized.
I mean, people say this stuff, but many opinions attributed to Abu Hanifa are surely not his or misrepresentations of his view, as Calderini is, I think, shown in this and Sadiqi and other scholars.
And I think, actually, what Jonathan Brown was saying in that particular discussion was that they say that a modern scholar who has the kind of weight, a very sort of is seen as a serious jurist, can invoke those sorts of things. I think he was quoting Ali Gomez specifically, saying Ali Gomez said that serious modern scholars. I'm paraphrasing and probably mangling his words here, but serious modern scholars, can invoke these, and they're allowed to deploy them, but it shouldn't just be used, loosely.
Well, this is how one respect in which the discourse has changed, according to Calderini. You have many voices and perspectives being aired for better or for worse.
Which actually, in many respects, resembles the earliest period where you had this sort of vast ocean of diverse opinions, which are in some sense brought into sort of the codification episteme, to quote Fakr Ibrahim, just for the purpose, because of the social logic of taqlid and things like that. And I think all of that sort of crumbling in the context of modernity allows for, in a sense, the refashioning of the entire system, and that's what we're witnessing before our eyes. And it will cause a great deal of anxiety for a lot of people, but it will open up doors that were previously closed for a lot of people as well. So let's see what things settle on, so to speak. Yeah. I'm a bit conscious of time, Omar. I didn't mean to interrupt you, but if you wanted to finish off, and then
of course I cannot do justice to this book in an hour, but another motif is this kind of constant invocation of this parallel between Imama Kubra and Sughra. Right. So, and she talks about the criterion for prayer leadership, fadila and so on, in the context of politics, fadila and sabiqa, excellence and precedence that Asma Afsaruddin has discussed. And in the Quran and in the Hadith corpus, the criterion that emerged most strongly for who should lead prayer is if I know that. Yeah. So it's really
interpret that in a particular way, of course.
Somewhat egalitarian in the sense that knowledge and piety, to a large extent, are really the key things. The jurists often say it's not knowledge of the Quran; it's actually knowledge of law, because then you couldn't perform correctly and so on. Yes, in the Hadith and the kind of, if you like, Muhammadan intervention, sallallahu was a disruptive one. So she says that in the Hadith, quite clearly, most of the time at least, knowledge, in the sense of knowledge of the Quran, is prioritized over other considerations. And you find Hadith reports not only of women leading other women and also leading men, as the case of the Waraqah Hadith in prayer, but you also find, slaves, a blind man, and children leading adults in prayer, for example. So on all of the kind of binaries of Islamic law, where the adult, minor, slave, free, these binaries Kisha Ali has discussed a lot, male, female, as far as prayer leadership is concerned, you have reports subverting all of these hierarchies in a kind of egalitarian direction. Now, that's not necessarily how the legal schools understood these. So she said the Shafi'is and some Imami Shia accept the prayer at the imamah of a mumayyiz child above the age of tamyiz, 7 or 8 or so, but most require bulugh in an imam. They has to have obtained his majority. So this is another consideration, and there are indeed many other things, but we should probably turn to address.
We should address the questions. And there are actually 3 questions from Jan Islam, our good friend from Edinburgh University, of course, and the regular sort of interlocutor of ours in the Q&A. And if anyone else has any questions, please feel free to ask them now, because sometimes what happens is they get asked a bit later and we miss them because we come to the end of our time. So Jan Islam's first, I guess, is maybe more of a comment. One recent controversy was over the BBC podcast, where the leader of the MCB recently elected Zahra Muhammad. Zara Muhammad, I should know her.
Both the first female and the youngest ever leader of the Muslim Council of Britain, being this umbrella body that represents, Sunni, Shia, various other.
Yeah, for those beyond the British Isles, I guess we shouldn't assume that you know what the MCB is. If you're a British, I hope you do know what the MCB is, the Muslim Council of Britain. But she was pressured over the issue of female imams, basically this really sort of absurdly hostile, white woman radio presenter, sort of, in essence, trying to portray herself as defending the rights of women, and attacks the MCB's first sort of Muslim woman head, and harangues her over the fact that, don't you know if there are any Muslim women imams in the country? I mean, and shouldn't this be your primary concern? And I think it was an interesting discussion. Yeah. But Jan Islam basically says this raises concerns over the equivalence of imams and priests.
Yeah.
Also of
I should emphasize. So there's the rest of the question. Yeah.
I'm not sure that's a separate question. So we can.
All right. Okay. Yeah. So one thing Simonetta says is she focuses on specifically leadership in ritual prayer. Now, what is the imam? An imam has, especially in the British context, many functions. You're a counsellor. Imams are forced to wear many hats, as it were. Right. And even when it comes to a thing like preaching, I mean, certainly accounts of women preaching to men in the pre-mod context are fairly common. So even Aisha herself, as we mentioned last week, and Al-Ha'ari's book, Preach to Men in Mosques. Calderini mentions incidents in the 12th and 14th centuries. Zainab al-Baghdadi, I think. Ghazal al-Haruriya, according to al-Malati, I think is the first to mention it. Sahib Kitab al-Tanbih wa Rad ala al-Ahwa. He mentions this Ghazal al-Haruriya, who is mistakenly understood to have led men in prayer, as having preached a sermon in the cathedral mosque or the Jami'ah of Kufa. Right. So some of these other roles one would associate with religious leadership, and women have performed. Mm-hmm. Prayer is much less common than the other ones. Mm-hmm. So she does kind of mention this point to her credit.
Yeah, and I think some of these are the case of the BBC presenter is a case where I think someone's basically trying to reflect or analogize to other religious traditions where there may be sort of very serious and contentious debates as well on regarding women's leadership. I think it's worth sort of highlighting a remark that was made in the wake of that, which was that no one wants to be an imam in this country.
It's terrible. I mean,
unfortunately, a great sort of article on The Nation, I think in the US, or Slate, I can't remember now, one of these online magazines, which was asking about, how much is an imam versus a rabbi versus a priest paid? Yeah. And, imams were paid basically, less than wages, unfortunately. And, this is, of course, a reflection of various kinds of challenges that exist within the sort of communities, very often immigrant communities that are kind of just getting on their feet in their second or third generation sometimes. And so I'm hopeful that will slowly change. There's a great consciousness within the Muslim community in this country, and I hope in other countries as well where this is happening. The second question, I'll just put it on the screen and read it for the people who are on the replay. My question is, how can Muslims negotiate between the establishment of gender roles in the early Muslim Ummah and attempts to overcome them in a response to modern liberalism's insistence on equality? This is a big question, actually.
I mean, so these precedents do exist. Calderini shows with abundant clarity.
Right.
And inevitably they will be mobilized in the modern period because of this overriding concern with equality and egalitarianism and so on. And that's, I think, to be expected.
I mean, Jan Islam, who's also, put this question forward, he does highlight sort of modern liberalism's insistence on equality. And arguably it's beyond liberalism, of course, as well. So Marxism and other ideologies, modern ideologies, will hold these sorts of standards as well. But I mean, forgive me for interrupting you, Omar, and please do feel free to finish. I was just going to say that in some respects, this is what I kind of remarked on last week, which is you have competing normativities now. And I remember a remark by Abdul Hakim Murad of Cambridge Muslim College about, I heard this, he gave a lecture at Oxford probably around 13 years ago now. And he made a remark which will resonate with a lot of Muslims who are, very committed to the theological tradition, and he basically said the ijma' of Westerners is not a hujjah in the Sharia, which I mean sounded really quite amusing at the time. But it's in many respects how a lot
of. Usaama, we live in a globalized world, so these debates are also. I mean, one of the staunchest advocates of female prayer is the late Gamal al-Banna, died in 2013. Who she discusses his book on this issue.
Right.
And I mentioned Qaradawi, and there are others as well.
I'm not sort of course, I'm not making a remark about female prayer per se here. I'm just saying that a lot of the theologically minded, and I'm not suggesting sort of everyone is theologically minded in this way, are very concerned about those sorts of pressures. And I think Jonathan Brown actually highlights this quite nicely in his Misquoting Muhammad, where in a sense, why is Jamal al-Banna making that argument, right? Why are a lot of these people making these arguments? Because of considerable pressures that, emerge from outside. Brown has this very interesting sort of phrase where he says the Qibla shifted from Mecca to the West. And that is, of course, I mean, he's talking about, other particular instances. Here you actually have a case where there's precedent within the tradition itself, which is actually textually quite sort of like persuasive. And this is, Brown makes the same point in that book as well. And he, argues that Waraqah is sound precedent for this sort of this ruling. But it's not, he's not pulling something out of a hat here. There are hadiths that are in canonical and quasi-canonical sources, and there are early jurists who had these positions, and there are later jurists who had these positions. So in a sense, it's a different sort of scenario. I'm just making it.
Yeah, no, it's a tricky one. This is the $64,000 question, as it were. I should say, Calderini discusses Tabari. I think Tabari specifically, and because he has this, when you read these opinions, many people, I think, anachronistically will claim that, Tabari was a feminist or something like this, which I think is obviously mistaken. She says, well, Tabari's concern is just the ritual validity of acts. Now, Tabari will have that opinion coming from one perspective, and moderns will, there's no way of ignoring this context in which we live. You cannot mentally, even if you try to kind of avoid egalitarianism for whatever reason.
They're all situated, and Tabari is situated as well, of course. I mean, when you're saying that he's looking purely at textual, you and Calderini will both completely recognize that he obviously is situated in a particular context. And I think that historical discussion is also so crucial for understanding this Fasad al-Zaman argument. I'm very intrigued by this argument, which you suggest that Calderini makes, but I'm hearing from you mainly that, in a sense, the stratification of more complex societies creates this urge to, separate out and in some respects seclude, particularly class women, in a way that you don't have classes, right, like that in Arabian society. Certainly not in the Bedouin culture, but even within sort of cities in Arabia at the time, which would have been very, very primitive by the standards of.
Yeah. So, and if you look at the sources like Ibn Sa'd, and she mentions Salama, the wife of one of the wives of the Prophet, and I know that Yasmin Amin has even created this musnad of Salama that she's edited. I think it's coming out with Brill. Very exciting, based on her master's thesis at AUC. But these women have like a character and a personality in the sources. Salama is the one she rebukes Omar in some contexts,
right? And
she is the one, the sabab of this precisely. Why is God not addressing women in the Quran and this verse? So, and we saw in the previous week that women are linked to about a dozen sabab or asbab and nuzuls, if you like, in the tafsir literature. So these women have character, they have a personality, they're not wallflowers in any sense. And yet, if you were to look at the kind of discourse several centuries later, the woman who had the most agency and who spoke up would be Qiyan, slave woman and so on, elite slave woman and others.
I mean,
Bedouins and so on.
In the sort of the more textually oriented, so people who are compiling, I'd be interested in looking at how Dhahabi or Ibn Hajar or Mizzi. Mizzi maybe, I don't know if he goes too much into anecdote, but certainly Dhahabi would in Siyar A'lam al-Nubala. How does his portrayal of someone like Salama differ from that of Ibn Sa'd? Because I feel that someone like Al-Jahil, and some people have suggested that the more philosophically oriented tend to be more marginalizing of women, but I think this might be maybe contradicted by Jahil to a certain extent. I mean, it would be interesting to see how that, and there has been scholarship suggesting that within Hadith scholars, I think Asma Sa'id makes this point.
So I want to make 2 points because I'm aware where we should sort of end soon. The first is just to illustrate this point you're saying about textualists. She mentions, and Benam Sadeghi mentions, Al-Aini, whom Sadeghi terms a maverick, notwithstanding his Hanafism. He bucks the trend, and based on his Mamluk Hanafis were generally more textually oriented. So he disregards the Hanafi rule based on the Hadith. So he seems somewhat exceptional in this regard. But also in response to your point about, gosh, what were you just saying? Remind me.
Forgive me, I've kind of.
Siyar A'lam al-Nubala. So yes.
It escapes me as well. Forgive me. I'm conscious of the time. If it's okay, I'm going to just show Islam's final question, and then we'll sort of conclude the session, hopefully, inshallah. But also important, I think this might be a comment. You mentioned the notion of fiqh as ex post facto justification for both traditionalists and feminists. For feminists, but is not the agreed purpose of the Quran and Sunnah precisely to avoid this? I mean, I think that's the entire point of the debate, right? I mean,
this is the kind of argument Ibn Hazm will make. So, for instance, on a whole range of rulings that and Hina Azam has a great book chapter on this in the web shrift for Amina Wadud, that most fuqaha and many of the Salaf discounted the woman's testimony and had cases entirely, disregarded it. And Ibn Hazm says, well, no, the rule that applies normally should apply here as well. Now, Ibn Hazm is not a feminist. This view, like many of his other distinctive views, is a function of his legal theory, his commitment to texts, and so on. So,
forgive me, go ahead.
So, to some extent, historically, jurists like Al-Aini, who are textualists, have been able to override this kind of Fasad al-Zaman argument by appealing to texts.
Right.
Ibn Hazm is a case in point. But, and this is the point I remembered I want to make, even textualist jurists, such as Ibn Taymiyyah, even Ahmed himself, do succumb to this logic. Ibn Taymiyyah, when it comes to the issue of slave woman veiling, for instance, which Omar reportedly forbidden. I've got an article discussing this coming out soon, hopefully. Omar forbids, and in some accounts, rebukes a slave woman for veiling and so on. Ahmed, in his Masail, I believe, I forget which Rawi, says, إذا كانت جميلة تنتقب. So for Ahmed, the concern is fitna rather than distinguishing free persons from slaves, and much more could be said about this, but I'm aware that we've gone somewhat over, so I will kind of end.
Opportunity to highlight that you will, inshallah, be publishing an article on this. What's the journal going to be?
Islamic Law and Society. I'll put all of the things we mentioned in this episode in the comments on the YouTube video.
That's wonderful. Jazakumullah khairan, Omar. Really always a fascinating and insightful discussion. And of course, we thank Simonetta Calderini for writing this book.
Thank you, Simonetta.
Discussion in the first place. And with that, I'd like to just sort of give the floor to you, Omar, just to briefly discuss what the book for next week will be.
Yes. So next week, I'm very pleased to report another much-awaited book that I'm very excited about discussing. We will be looking at Junaid Qadri's Transformations of Tradition, Islamic Law in Colonial Modernity, based on his excellent thesis. We'll see how much it diverges from the thesis on al-Muti'i. It looks at questions of the history of science, Islamic law, and how it changes in the colonial period and so on. So very excited about discussing that next week. So please join us for that episode.
And we really do look forward to that, and we hope you will all join us then, inshallah. For those of you who would like to get notifications, please do subscribe on YouTube or follow on sort of Twitter or like on Facebook, and inshallah you'll get notifications eventually. Jazakumullah khairan, Omar, again for really a wonderful session, and until next week, we'll see you, bi'idhnillah. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah.